Dawn breaks over the training grounds of medieval Cairo, and you're about to witness something that changed warfare forever. Forget everything you think you know about medieval knights charging with lances. The real masters of mounted combat weren't the heavily armoured European cavalry everyone talks about. They were the Mamluks, slave soldiers who became the most feared horse archers in history. Picture this: you're a young recruit who's never held a bow in your life, and by sunset today, you need to hit targets while galloping at full speed. Sound impossible? Welcome to Mamluk training, where turning farm boys into deadly cavalry archers wasn't just an art, it was a survival skill that kept empires alive. The Mamluks didn't mess around when it came to training. These weren't weekend warriors practicing in their spare time. We're talking about a military machine that spent decades perfecting techniques that made European knights look like they were riding hobby horses. One Mamluk archer could loose 12 accurate arrows in the time it took a knight to couch his lance for a single charge. Do the math. That's 12 chances to end a fight before it even starts. What made them so deadly wasn't just their skill with a bow or their horsemanship. It was the combination of both, performed at speeds that would make modern cavalry units nervous. They could shoot forwards, backwards, sideways, and even underneath their horse's neck while maintaining a full gallop. Try doing that on your bicycle, and you'll appreciate just how impossible this sounds. Today, we're spending a complete training day with a Mamluk regiment, following a novice as he progresses from fumbling with equipment to executing live fire drills that would impress Olympic archers. But first, let's talk about the weapon that made it all possible. A bow so advanced it wouldn't look out of place in a modern archery competition. The Mamluk composite bow wasn't just a piece of wood with a string. This thing was a masterpiece of medieval engineering that took skilled craftsmen months to create. The secret lay in its construction: 3 different materials layered together like a medieval sandwich. The back of the bow, facing away from the archer, was made from sinew taken from animal tendons. This material could stretch without breaking, storing enormous amounts of energy. The belly of the bow, facing toward the archer, was crafted from horn, usually water buffalo horn that had been carefully shaped and seasoned. Horn compresses beautifully without cracking, making it perfect for the side that gets squeezed during the draw. Between these 2 layers sat a core of wood, typically maple or birch, chosen for its flexibility and strength. The whole assembly was glued together with a mixture that included fish bladder, hide glue, and other secret ingredients that bowyers guarded more carefully than their wives' cooking recipes. The process took so long that a master bowyer might only complete a dozen bows per year. Each one was essentially a custom-made precision instrument. But here's where it gets really interesting: the CRs. These were rigid tips made from hardwood or horn that extended beyond the working limbs of the bow. They weren't just decorative, they were crucial to the bow's performance. The CRs acted like levers, allowing the bow to store more energy while keeping the overall length manageable for use on horseback. A Mamluk could draw his bow to his ear while mounted, something that would be impossible with a longer English longbow. The string itself deserves mention. Made from twisted silk or the finest sinew, it was protected by small leather guards called string bridges at the points where it might contact the bow during shooting. These weren't just comfort features. They prevented the string from wearing through during the thousands of practice shots every Mamluk archer would loose during training. Now comes the part that separated Mamluk archers from everyone else: the thumb draw. While European archers pulled their strings with 3 fingers, Mamluks used their thumb, protected by a specialized ring made from stone, bone, or metal. This technique allowed for faster shooting and better control, especially while mounted. The thumb ring wasn't just protective gear, it was a precision tool that determined how cleanly the arrow would release. Watch a novice archer try the thumb draw for the first time, and you'll see why Mamluk training was so intensive. The motion feels completely unnatural to anyone used to the Mediterranean draw. Your thumb has to hook the string. Your index finger provides support, and your hand position changes everything about how the bow behaves. Get it wrong, and your arrow goes anywhere except where you're aiming. The morning training session always started with bow anatomy because understanding your weapon was literally a matter of life and death. A broken bow in battle meant you were suddenly just another guy on a horse, surrounded by enemies who very much wanted you dead. Every archer learned to inspect his bow for stress cracks in the horn, loosening of the sinew backing, or wear on the string attachment points. But knowing your bow was pointless if you couldn't stay on your horse while using it. That's where the real challenge began, learning to shoot accurately while your mount was doing everything possible to throw off your aim. The secret wasn't just in the archery, it was in the horsemanship that made accurate shooting possible. Saddle fit became crucial because the wrong saddle could turn you into a human bobblehead every time your horse took a step. Mamluk saddles were specifically designed for archery, with a high cantle that supported the rider's back during the draw, and a pommel that allowed for freedom of movement. The stirrups were positioned to create a stable shooting platform, while still allowing the rider to control his mount through leg pressure alone. This is where things get really impressive. A properly trained Mamluk archer could guide his horse using only his legs and weight shifts, leaving both hands completely free for his bow. The reins were either dropped entirely during shooting or held in the teeth, a technique that probably looked ridiculous but worked perfectly in practice. The training ground where novices learned these skills was a carefully designed space that gradually increased in difficulty. It started with stationary targets and horses moving at a walk, then progressed through trotting, and finally to full gallop shooting. Each stage presented new challenges that had to be mastered before moving on. At walking speed, the biggest challenge was learning to cant the bow, tilting it at an angle to clear the horse's neck and mane. This wasn't intuitive for new archers, who naturally wanted to hold the bow vertically like they'd seen in paintings. But on horseback, a vertical bow was a recipe for disaster. The canted position also allowed for quicker draw and release, essential skills for combat shooting. Quick knocking from a hip quiver was another skill that separated beginners from experts. The quiver wasn't just a container for arrows. It was positioned and designed to allow for lightning-fast arrow selection and knocking while maintaining perfect control of the horse. The best archers could knock, draw, aim and release in a single fluid motion that took less than 2 seconds. But speed meant nothing without accuracy, which is where grouping shots became the real test of skill. A Mamluk archer was expected to maintain consistent accuracy regardless of his horse's gait. This required perfect timing, releasing the arrow at exactly the right moment in the horse's stride, when the motion was most predictable. The morning session focused on these fundamental skills because everything that came later depended on mastering them. By noon, a successful novice would be hitting targets consistently at all 3 gates, ready to move on to the tactical exercises that would test everything he'd learned under combat conditions. The afternoon session transformed everything the novice had learned into combat reality. Coaches barked orders about range-finding techniques that could mean the difference between a successful raid and riding into an ambush. These weren't classroom lessons, they were survival skills taught by men who'd used them to stay alive against impossible odds. Learning to read distance by landmarks was like developing a 6th sense. Experienced Mamluks could estimate range to within 10 yards just by looking at how a man's helmet caught the light, or how clearly they could see a horse's legs moving. The trick wasn't just judging distance once, it was constantly updating those calculations as everything moved at high speed across the battlefield. Wind reading became an art form that made modern meteorologists look like amateurs. Mamluks didn't have weather stations or instruments. They had pennons, dust clouds, and the feel of air on their faces. Watch an expert archer scan the field before a charge, and you'd see him checking every banner, every wisp of sand, every movement of grass to calculate exactly how the wind would push his arrows off target. The really impressive part was making rapid corrections without falling into the trap of over-aiming. Novice archers wanted to line up every shot like they were threading a needle, but combat archery was about instinctive shooting. The corrections came from subtle adjustments in release technique and shoulder alignment, tiny changes that could shift an arrow's impact by several feet at long range. One particularly challenging drill involved shooting at targets while the wind conditions changed constantly. Coaches would wave large cloth banners to create artificial gusts, forcing archers to adapt their aim in real time. It sounds cruel, but consider this. In actual combat, enemy cavalry would kick up massive dust clouds that changed wind patterns every few seconds. Training had to be harder than war, or war would be impossible to survive. The tactical exercises that followed made the morning's individual skills look simple by comparison. Everything now depended on unit coordination and split-second timing. The peel and shoot formation was pure genius in its simplicity and absolutely terrifying in its execution. Picture 50 mounted archers galloping toward enemy lines in a loose formation. As they reached optimal range, the lead riders would suddenly wheel to the right, shooting as they turned. The second rank would continue forward a few more yards before executing the same maneuver, followed by the third rank, and so on. What the enemy saw was a continuous stream of arrows coming from riders who seemed to appear out of nowhere, shoot with deadly accuracy, then vanish before return fire could be effective. The timing had to be perfect. Too early, and you'd waste arrows on targets out of range. Too late, and you'd ride into the enemy's weapons before you could shoot. Coaches used drums to signal the exact moment for each rank to execute their turn, but experienced units could feel the rhythm without musical cues. It was like a deadly dance where missing a step meant death. Caracole variations added another layer of complexity to the formation work. Unlike the linear peel and shoot, caracole tactics involved continuous circular or figure-8 patterns around enemy formations. The goal was to maintain constant arrow pressure while never presenting a static target for enemy archers or spearmen to focus on. The most advanced caracole required riders to shoot both while approaching and while withdrawing from the target, effectively doubling their rate of fire. This meant mastering both forward and backward shooting techniques, the backward shots being significantly more difficult because they required the archer to twist in his saddle while maintaining perfect horse control. But the crown jewel of Mamluk tactics was the feigned retreat with controlled turnbacks. This maneuver had broken more enemy formations than any other single tactic in medieval warfare. It looked simple. Mamluk units would engage the enemy briefly, then appear to flee in panic. Enemy cavalry, sensing victory, would charge after them in pursuit. Here's where the genius showed. The fleeing Mamluks would suddenly wheel around in perfect formation and unleash devastating volleys at the pursuing enemies, who were now strung out and vulnerable. The psychological effect was as important as the physical damage. Nothing broke enemy morale quite like realizing they'd been suckered into a trap by superior tactics. The controlled turnback required incredible discipline and timing. Every rider had to resist the natural urge to actually flee when enemy cavalry was thundering up behind them. The signal to turn and fight came from banner signals and drum beats. But it took nerves of steel to wait for that signal when death was breathing down your neck. Training for this maneuver involved coaches playing the role of pursuing enemies, complete with war cries and weapon flourishing designed to test the archer's nerve. More than one novice discovered he wasn't cut out for Mamluk service during these exercises. There's no shame in that. It takes a special kind of warrior to deliberately put himself in mortal danger as part of a tactical plan. The coordination signals that made all these maneuvers possible were almost as impressive as the riding and shooting skills themselves. Drum patterns could communicate complex tactical information across the chaos of battle. A specific rhythm might mean execute peel and shoot formation, while a different pattern signaled prepare for caracole left, or feigned retreat on my signal. Banner signals provided visual commands for units that were too far away to hear drums clearly. Different coloured banners, banner positions, and even the way banners moved could convey detailed tactical instructions. A red banner raised high might mean attack formation, while the same banner lowered and waved side to side could signal withdraw by ranks. The most skilled Mamluk commanders could coordinate hundreds of mounted archers using nothing but these visual and audio signals. They could split their force into multiple units, send them on complex maneuvers around the battlefield, and bring them back together for coordinated attacks, all without shouting a single verbal order that enemies might overhear. By late afternoon, the novice archer, who'd started the day fumbling with bow components, was executing complex tactical maneuvers alongside experienced veterans. The transformation was remarkable, but it came at a cost. Every muscle in his body ached from hours of riding and shooting. His fingers were raw from the bowstring despite his thumb ring, and his mind was swimming with tactical knowledge that would take months to fully absorb. But he wasn't done yet. The final phase of training focused on equipment maintenance, skills that were just as crucial as shooting accuracy for long-term survival. Equipment maintenance wasn't just about keeping your gear pretty. It was about staying alive when your life depended on a piece of wood, horn, and sinew that had been stressed to its breaking point all day. The first rule every Mamluk learned was simple. Never leave your bow strung when you're not using it. Sounds obvious, right? Tell that to the dozens of archers who learned this lesson the hard way when their bow limbs snapped during the next day's training. Unstringing a composite bow after intensive use was like defusing a bomb made of animal parts. The bow had been under enormous tension for hours, and all that stored energy was just waiting for an excuse to explode. The process required patience and technique. Rushing it was a great way to send expensive bow parts flying across the training ground, like medieval shrapnel. The smart archers developed a ritual around unstringing that bordered on religious ceremony. They'd check the string attachment points for wear, examine the knocking point for fraying, and inspect every inch of the bow limbs for stress cracks that could spell disaster during tomorrow's session. Finding a hairline crack in your bow was like discovering your parachute had a hole in it, technically fixable, but not something you wanted to test under pressure. Checking limb reflex became an art form that separated careful archers from dead ones. A properly maintained composite bow should return to its original curved shape when unstrung, with the tips curving away from the archer. If the limbs stayed bent or showed uneven curves, it meant the bow was taking a set, permanent deformation that reduced power and accuracy. Some bows could be nursed back to health with careful treatment, but others were destined for the scrap heap. The bindings that held the bow together required constant attention. These weren't just decorative wrappings. They were structural elements that kept the horn, wood, and sinew layers working as a unit. Loose bindings meant the bow components could shift during the draw, creating inconsistent arrow flight that could turn a perfect shot into a complete miss. Worse yet, binding failure during a draw could cause catastrophic bow failure, sending sharp fragments into the archer's face. Rewrapping grips was like performing surgery on your most trusted friend. The grip area took tremendous abuse during training, with sweat, oils from the archer's hand, and constant pressure gradually breaking down the wrapping materials. A good grip wrap provided consistent hand placement and absorbed moisture that could otherwise make the bow slip at the worst possible moment. The technique involved multiple layers of leather or cord, each wrapped with specific tension and overlap patterns that master bowyers guarded like state secrets. Fletching repair was where archers became part-time surgeons and part-time artists. Arrows took incredible abuse during training, glancing off targets, hitting the ground at high speed, and occasionally getting stepped on by horses who had no respect for precision craftsmanship. A single damaged feather could send an arrow tumbling end over end instead of flying straight, turning a skilled archer into someone who couldn't hit the broad side of a pyramid. The process of replacing fletching required steady hands and endless patience. Each feather had to be cut to precise dimensions, shaped to match the arrow's intended flight characteristics, and attached with glue that would hold under the stress of shooting, but still allow for future repairs. The best fletchers could match the original feather pattern so perfectly that you couldn't tell which arrows had been repaired and which were fresh from the workshop. Arrow points received their own specialized attention. Iron broadheads dulled quickly during practice, especially when they hit hard targets or rocky ground. Keeping them sharp required whetstones, files, and techniques that turned maintenance time into weapons training. A dull arrowhead wasn't just ineffective, it was dangerous to the archer, since it required more force to penetrate targets and could cause the arrow to deflect unpredictably. Some archers carried multiple sets of arrow points for different purposes. Blunt points for training prevented damage to expensive targets and reduced the risk of injury during close quarters practice. Needle-sharp war points were reserved for actual combat and final qualification tests. The process of switching points required specialized tools and knowledge of metallurgy that made archers into part-time blacksmiths. Quiver maintenance was another critical skill that novices often overlooked until their arrows started falling out during galloping practice. The hip quiver had to be positioned perfectly to allow quick arrow selection while preventing loss during violent maneuvers. The interior was lined with soft materials to protect arrow fletching, while the exterior was reinforced to withstand the constant impact of arrows being drawn and returned during rapid shooting sequences. The quiver's attachment system required daily inspection and adjustment. Too loose, and it would bounce around during riding, making arrow selection impossible. Too tight, and it would restrict the archer's movement or interfere with bow handling. Finding the perfect balance required trial and error, with adjustments made based on each day's training experience. String care was perhaps the most critical maintenance task of all. The bowstring was under enormous tension every time the bow was drawn, and failure meant instant loss of all shooting capability. Strings were checked for fraying, stretching, and wear at the knocking point where arrows made contact. Smart archers carried multiple spare strings and knew how to replace them quickly, even while mounted. The timing requirements for string replacement were brutal. A worn string might give warning signs for days before finally snapping, but recognizing those signs required experience that only came from handling thousands of arrows. Some archers developed an almost supernatural ability to predict string failure. They could feel subtle changes in the string's tension or hear slight variations in the sound it made during release. After hours of maintenance work, tired archers faced the day's final challenge, the timed qualification run. This wasn't just a test of shooting accuracy, it was a comprehensive evaluation of everything they'd learned, performed under pressure that simulated combat conditions. The course included stationary targets, moving targets, and obstacles that required tactical decision-making while maintaining shooting accuracy. The qualification run started with basic accuracy tests at known distances, then progressed to more challenging scenarios that tested range estimation, wind reading, and rapid target acquisition. Archers rode through a course that included tight turns, sudden stops, and surprise targets that appeared without warning. Missing more than 2 shots meant automatic failure and another day of intensive remedial training. The most challenging part wasn't the shooting, it was maintaining composure while being evaluated. Instructors deliberately created distractions and pressure designed to simulate the chaos of actual combat. They'd shout conflicting orders, create artificial emergencies, and generally do everything possible to break the archer's concentration. Passing the qualification run required not just technical skill, but mental toughness that could withstand psychological pressure. The final scoring wasn't just about accuracy percentages. Instructors evaluated equipment handling, horse control, tactical decision-making, and adherence to safety protocols. An archer could shoot perfectly but still fail if he endangered other riders or demonstrated poor battlefield awareness. The Mamluks understood that individual skill meant nothing if it compromised unit effectiveness. Successful completion of the qualification run marked the transformation from novice to trained archer, but it wasn't a graduation, it was just the beginning. Real Mamluk training continued for years, with increasingly complex scenarios and higher performance standards. The single day of intensive training was designed to provide a foundation for a lifetime of continuous improvement. The integration of biomechanics, disciplined routines, and coordinated signaling created something greater than the sum of its parts. A Mamluk unit wasn't just a collection of individual archers. It was a precision instrument of warfare that could outmaneuver and outfight opponents who had superior numbers, heavier armor, or better individual warriors. The secret wasn't in any single technique, but in the seamless integration of multiple skills performed at the highest level under the most challenging conditions. This systematic approach to training explained why Mamluk cavalry consistently dominated battlefields across the medieval world. They didn't win through individual heroics or superior equipment. They won through superior preparation, coordination, and execution of proven techniques. Every aspect of their training was designed to create warriors who could function effectively as part of a larger tactical system, while maintaining the individual skills necessary for survival in close combat. The day's training had transformed a collection of individual skills into an integrated combat system. But tomorrow would bring new challenges and higher expectations. The real test of a Mamluk archer wasn't what he could do on the training ground. It was what happened when everything went wrong at once. Because let me tell you, medieval warfare had a nasty habit of turning perfect plans into complete disasters, faster than you could say, incoming arrows. Picture this. You're galloping toward enemy lines with your unit. Everything's going according to plan, when suddenly your horse steps in a hole and stumbles. Your carefully practiced grip on the reins shifts, your bow hand wavers, and that target you've been lining up for the past 30 seconds just became a moving blur. Meanwhile, enemy archers are sending their own arrows your way, and they don't particularly care that you're having equipment difficulties. This is where months of relentless drilling paid off in ways that couldn't be measured during peaceful target practice. The muscle memory developed through thousands of repetitions meant that even when conscious thought failed, the body knew what to do. Experienced Mamluks could recover from stumbles, adjust for unexpected obstacles, and maintain shooting accuracy even when their world was literally falling apart beneath them. The training cadre had a saying, "Practice until you can't get it wrong." This wasn't just motivational nonsense. It was a survival strategy based on brutal battlefield experience. When arrows are flying and horses are screaming, there's no time to remember which technique to use or debate the finer points of thumb ring positioning. Everything has to be automatic, instinctive, and absolutely reliable. But individual resilience was only half the equation. The real magic happened when an entire unit could maintain tactical cohesion despite chaos that would scatter lesser forces, like leaves in a windstorm. Watch 50 Mamluk archers execute a perfect caracal while under fire, and you'd witness something that looked less like military tactics and more like choreographed sorcery. The key was layered redundancy built into every aspect of their system. If the lead rider missed his turn signal, the second rank knew to compensate. If drum signals were drowned out by battle noise, banner signals provided backup communication. If primary targets became unavailable, secondary objectives were already identified and prioritized. Nothing was left to chance, because chance had a tendency to get people killed. And that's how a single day transformed a fumbling novice into something resembling a Mamluk archer. From dawn to dusk, we watched precision engineering meet brutal training methods, creating warriors who could shoot 12 arrows while knights were still trying to figure out which end of their lance to hold. The combination of advanced composite bow technology, intensive horsemanship training, and tactical coordination that would make modern special forces jealous explains why these mounted archers dominated medieval battlefields for centuries. Next time you see a movie with knights charging dramatically into battle, remember, the real masters of mounted combat were probably shooting them full of arrows before they got close enough to use those fancy lances.